Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are opening a file that is, well, to put it mildly, it is messy, it's complicated, but it's also, I think, incredibly beautiful in its own way. We're looking at a man who was just a walking contradiction.
That's the perfect way to put it, a walking contradiction.
I mean, we're talking about a figure who was a devout, almost fanatical Catholic at times, yet he was convicted and imprisoned for sodomy. He wrote some of the most tender musical poetry in the French language, stuff that feels like a whisper in your ear, and yet he's maybe most famous for shooting his lover with a pistol in a drunken rage.
It's the ultimate case study in how chaos can sometimes produce, well, clarity, at least in art. We are talking, of course, about Paul Verlaine.
The Prince of Poets.
Exactly. And the archetype of the poet, maudit, the cursed poet.
I love that term, poet maudit. It sounds so dramatic, you know? It sounds like a brand. But what's our actual mission today? Because you look at his biography, and on the surface, it starts out looking like he's going to be a boring civil servant. So how do we get from a desk job to a prison cell in Belgium?
That is the central question, isn't it? We really want to try and understand how this man, born into a respectable petit bourgeois family, a man who held a steady government job, how he became the symbol of the bohemian, destructive, decadent artist.
Right.
And more than that, we need to understand how his personal wreckage, his complete and utter chaos, gave birth to the symbolist movement. Because without Verlaine, modern poetry as we know it, it just doesn't exist in the same way.
And we have quite the stack of sources to get us there. We've got the biographical records, we have literary analysis of his major works, things like poems, Saturnians, and romances, sans paroles, and we even have some fascinating, almost unbelievable historical footnotes involving World War II.
Which is where the stakes of this whole story really become clear. Because Verlaine isn't just some 19th century figure who drank himself to death in poverty. His influence is massive. It stretches all the way from the fin de siècle salons of Paris to the beaches of Normandy in 1944.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start at the very beginning. You mentioned he was born into a petit bourgeois family. That sounds, well, it sounds very safe, very normal.
It was intended to be safe. He was born in Metz in 1844. His father, Nicolas Auguste, was a captain in the army, a military man, very disciplined, probably quite rigid. And his mother, Elisa Stephanie de Hay, was, well, devoted is the word the historians use, but that is putting it so mildly. She was, I think, obsessive.
Obsessive? Why do you say that? Was it just, typical motherly love or something more?
It was something more. You have to look at the context. Paul Verlaine was a miracle child.
A miracle child.
His mother had miscarried 3 times before he was born. And this is a detail that just sticks with you, she had jars with the preserved fetuses on her mantelpiece for years.
Whoa, wait, she what, on the mantelpiece?
I know, it's a lot. It says a very specific psychological stage, doesn't it? You can just imagine the pressure, the intense focus that was placed on this one surviving boy. They actually baptized him, Paul.
Marie, as in the Virgin Mary.
Exactly. It was a direct act of gratitude to the Virgin Mary for his survival. He was their only biological child. They did have an adopted daughter, an orphaned cousin of his named Elisa, but Paul was the absolute center of his mother's world. She indulged him, she protected him, and you have to think she probably suffocated him quite a bit.
So he grows up in this really intense, loving, but also kind of claustrophobic religious environment. He goes to a good school, right? The Lycée Impérial Bonaparte, which is now the Lycée Condorcet. That's a prestigious spot.
Oh, absolutely. A top-tier education. And for a while, he follows the path that was laid out for him. He gets a degree in letters, and then he takes up a post in the civil service, an insurance company first, then the Paris City Hall. He's living in the Batignolles district. On paper, he is absolutely set for a quiet, respectable life. He's a clerk. He pushes paper.
But the cracks appear really early, don't they? He's not just stamping forms and going home. He's writing. He's living a double life, almost.
He is. He began writing poetry at a very early age. And what's really interesting is who he was hanging out with. He wasn't just sitting at home with his mother. He was frequenting literary salons, specifically the salon of the Marquise de Girard. And this puts him in the room with the heavy hitters of the day.
Like who?
People like Anatole France, the composer Emmanuel Chabrier, Villiers de l'Isle-Adam. These were the literary lions of Paris.
That's quite the social circle for a civil servant. It's like being an accountant by day and hanging out with rock stars by night.
It really is. And it shows his ambition. He wanted in. He wanted to be part of that world. And initially, he was very heavily influenced by the dominant movement of the time, the Parnassian movement.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. Quick refresher for us. Parnassianism, it sounds like a mountain.
Well, it is named after Mount Parnassus, the home of the Muses in Greek mythology. So think of it as art for art's sake. It was a direct reaction against Romanticism.
So less of Victor Hugo crying about his feelings.
Exactly. Romanticism was all big emotions, suffering, nature, the individual ego. The Parnassians, led by figures like Leconte de Lisle, basically said, no, stop the whining. They valued craftsmanship, objectivity, and precise, rigid form over these emotional outpourings. They wanted a poem to be like a perfectly carved marble statue. Beautiful, cold, and perfect. Impersonal.
And you can see that discipline in Verlaine's first published collection.
You can. It's called Poème Saturnian, Saturnine Poems.
Yeah.
And it came out in 1866. He was just 22 years old.
22. That's incredibly young to have a published collection. Was it a hit? Did it make him famous overnight?
Not exactly a hit, no. It established him as a poet of promise, definitely. It showed real originality. But it wasn't universally loved. The most famous critic of the day, Saint-Duvay, made some adverse comments. But even then, other critics could see he was doing something different. Even while he was trying to be this rigid Parnassian, he was already playing with that musicality that would become his trademark.
The emotion was already seeking through.
He couldn't help it. The feeling was already leaking through the cracks of the marble, so to speak.
So he has this literary life bubbling up, this artistic ambition, but he tries to do the normal thing again. He gets married.
Yes, in 1870, he marries Mathilde Motet. He was very young, barely 17, and she was a writer herself. It seemed for a moment like a good match. He even wrote a collection of poems for her, Le Baume, Chanson de Good Song, which are these very sweet, almost conventional love poems.
But this is right when history takes a very sharp turn, isn't it? Because 1870 isn't just the year of his marriage. It's the year of the Third Republic and the Franco-Prussian War.
Precisely. And this is a side of Verlaine that people often forget. We think of the drunk, chaotic poet. But in 1870, he joined the 160th Battalion of the Garde Nationale. He put on a uniform. He patrolled the ramparts of Paris during the siege and the freezing cold. He was a patriot.
And then things get even more political. When the Paris Commune was declared in 1871, this radical socialist government that took over Paris after the war, Verlaine didn't flee. He stayed. He turned communard.
He did. Most of his bourgeois friends and family, they fled to Versailles with the official government. Verlaine stayed. And he wasn't just a foot soldier. He was appointed head of the press bureau of the Central Committee. He was right in the thick of the administration of this revolution.
That's just wild. The Prince of Poets was a press officer for a radical revolution.
And it was incredibly dangerous. When the French army retook Paris during what's known as the Bloody Week, the Semaine Sanglante, it was a massacre. Thousands of communards were executed in the streets. Verlaine had to escape. He went into hiding in the Pas de Calais to avoid being arrested or shot.
So he survives the war. He survives the revolution. He comes back to Paris in August of 1871. He has a wife, Mathilde. They have an infant son now, Georges. He has his life back. He's dodged a bullet, literally and metaphorically.
He has a real chance to just settle down, go back to his desk job, be a husband and a father. But then he gets a letter.
The letter. This is it. This is the turning point, the moment everything changes.
September 1871. He receives a letter from a young, unknown poet in the provinces, Arthur Rimbaud. Rimbaud sent him some of his poems, including Le Bateau Ivre, the drunken boat, and Verlaine was, he was struck, thunderstruck. He famously replied with the lines, "Come, dear great soul, we awake you, we desire you."
Dear great soul. And Rimbaud was, what, 17?
Even younger when he wrote some of those poems. He was a full 10 years Verlaine's junior. Just this teenage prodigy from Charleville. So Verlaine brings him to Paris. In fact, he invites him to stay in his in-laws' house, where he and Mathilde were living with their baby.
That had to have been a disaster from day one.
Oh, it was a complete catastrophe. You have to picture Rimbaud.
Yeah.
He was brilliant, a genius, yes, but he was also a brat. He was deliberately provocative. He was dirty. He smoked a pipe upside down. He insulted everyone at the dinner table. He stole things. He was the absolute antithesis of the polite bourgeois world that Verlaine was living in. And Verlaine was just absolutely captivated.
So almost immediately, the normal life that Verlaine had tried to build with Mathilde just completely disintegrates.
It just dissolves. Within months, he has lost all interest in Mathilde. He's openly cruel to her. By 1872, he has effectively abandoned her and their infant son to run off with Rimbaud. And this begins one of the most famous and destructive relationships in all of literary history.
This is the rock star phase. I mean, reading about their time together, it just sounds exhausting.
A stormy affair is the classic understatement. They left Paris, they went to London in 1872, then to Brussels. They were drinking heavily, mostly absinthe, the green fairy, which we now know is highly addictive and has hallucinogenic properties. They were fighting constantly, breaking up, getting back together. It was this chaotic peregrination fueled by alcohol and pure genius.
I always wonder about the power dynamic there. Verlaine is the older man, he's the established poet with a published book, but it always feels like Rimbaud, the teenager, held all the cards.
He absolutely did. Rimbaud was the dominant personality. He was often cruel. He mocked Verlaine mercilessly. He called him the foolish virgin in his own writing. In A Season in Hell, he would taunt him about his weakness, about his lingering desire to go back to his wife and his normal life. Verlaine was just torn in two between his domestic instinct and this wild, feral genius that was Rimbaud.
And it all just builds and builds until it explodes in Brussels, July 12, 1873.
This is the climax of the whole drama.
Yeah.
Verlaine is in a drunken, jealous rage. Rimbaud has told him he's leaving him for good. Verlaine feels abandoned. He's full of guilt about Mathilde. He is just completely spiraling. He goes out and he buys a pistol.
A pistol. It's such a concrete, violent object for a man who deals in words and nuances.
And he goes back to their hotel room and he fires 2 shots at Rimbaud.
Does he try to kill him? What was the intent?
It's hard to say what the intent was in that state, but the result was that one bullet wounded Rimbaud in the left wrist. He didn't kill him. He didn't even seriously injure him, really. But the act itself, you can't undo that. The line has been crossed.
No, you absolutely cannot. And the law certainly didn't think so.
Not at all. Rimbaud, at first, pretends it's nothing, but then he gets scared that Verlaine will shoot him again, so he goes to the police. Verlaine is arrested. And here is where his past and his whole lifestyle catch up with him. He wasn't just charged with battery for the shooting. The investigation, the letters they found, the medical examinations, it revealed the nature of his relationship with Rimbaud. It was humiliating. And he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for battery and sodomy.
2 years for a poet, for anyone, really, that's a lifetime. He's sent to a prison in Mons, Belgium.
And this is so crucial, because if the shooting was the climax of his personal drama, then prison was the incubator for his greatest artistic breakthrough.
This is often the case with these cursed figures, isn't it? The suffering, the isolation. It fuels the art in a way that comfort never could.
It absolutely does. While he was incarcerated, he wrote the poems that would eventually be collected in romances, Sans Parole, Songs Without Words. These were published in 1874 while he was still locked up.
And what's fascinating about that collection is the content. It's not just, I hate prison or I'm so sorry.
Not at all. It's this strange, beautiful, psychologically complex blend. On one hand, you have these incredibly nostalgic, almost dreamlike recollections of his life with Mathilde, the wife he abandoned. He's rewriting history in his head, longing for that domestic bliss that he himself destroyed.
Then on the other hand,
you have these impressionistic sketches of his escapades with Rimbaud, little snapshots of London, of Brussels. It's like he's trying to hold these two completely contradictory lives together in verse, the good husband and the wild lover.
So he's sitting in a cell in Mons, writing about the 2 people he hurt the most.
And he's changing, or at least he's trying to, because in prison, Verlaine undergoes this intense reconversion to Roman Catholicism.
A reconversion?
Yes. Remember, he was the miracle child of a devout mother. He was Paul Marie. He returns to that faith with a fervor that is, it's very Verlaine. It's all or nothing. He writes a whole collection called Suggests Wisdom, which was published later in 1880, and it's just filled with religious sentiment, repentance, a deep desire for order and forgiveness.
How did Rimbaud take that? I can't imagine the wild teenage rebel was impressed by Verlaine finding God.
He was not. Rimbaud sharply criticized Verlaine's religious turn. He saw him one last time after Verlaine got out of prison, and he apparently found the whole pious act repulsive. He called it treacly bigotry. He saw it as a weakness, a betrayal of the rebellious spirit. He thought Verlaine was just trying to escape the reality of who he was.
So Verlaine gets out of prison. It's 1875. He's an ex-convict. He's a known sodomite in the eyes of the law. He can't exactly go back to his civil service job. What does he do?
This is the part of the story that always surprises people. He doesn't go straight back to the absinthe cafes of Paris. He goes to England, and he gets a job as a school teacher.
A teacher? The cursed poet, the man who shot Rimbaud, is now teaching school kids.
Yes, he taught French, Latin, Greek, and drawing. He worked at William Lovell School in a place called Stickney in Lincolnshire.
Stickney, Lincolnshire. I've been there. It is deep rural England. It's flat, it's quiet, it's about as far from a chaotic Brussels hotel room as you can get.
Exactly. It's an incredible image, isn't it? The contrast. A few years prior, he's in the thick of a revolution, then he's shooting his lover. Now, he's correcting Latin declensions in a tiny village in Lincolnshire. He later taught in Boston. That's Boston, Lincolnshire, not Massachusetts. And then he moved to Bournemouth.
And did he stay out of trouble? Did this quiet life work for him?
For a while, it seemed so. He was trying to live this quiet, pious life. He seemed to find some peace in the anonymity of the English countryside. He eventually returned to France in 1877 and took a teaching job in a town called Rethel. But then the old pattern repeats itself. He falls in love again.
Not with another poet this time?
No, with one of his pupils, a young man named Lucien Letinois.
A pupil? That's complicated.
It is. But for Verlaine, Lucien became this muse and almost an adopted son figure. You have to remember, he has a biological son, Georges, with Mathilde, but she's divorced him, and he's not allowed to see him. So he projects all of that paternal instinct, that desire for a family, onto Lucien. They even bought a farm together. Verlaine tried to be a farmer.
The prince of poets milking cows, it's hard to picture.
It didn't last. Tragedy struck again. Lucien died of typhus in 1883.
Oh, that's just awful. That has to be the breaking point.
It really was.
Yeah.
Verlaine was absolutely devastated. This seems to be the final straw that just pushed him back toward his darkest tendencies. The drinking, the instability, the poverty, the respectable, quiet life he had tried to build for a second time. It completely collapsed with Lucien's death.
So he falls back into the chaos. But at the same time, the literary world is starting to catch up to him, right? In 1884, he publishes an important work, Les Poètes Maudits.
This is a critical moment for literary history. Verlaine writes this series of essays profiling poets who he felt were misunderstood geniuses. People like Mallarmé, Tristan Corbière, and of course, Arthur Rimbaud, who had long since given up poetry. And in doing so, he popularizes this term, poet maudit.
Cursed poet.
Right. He didn't invent the phrase, but he defined it. He defined this archetype, the poet, as a social outcast, someone who fights against convention, who suffers social rebuke, who is ignored by the critics, but who possesses a superior, almost mystical vision. He was talking about them, but really he was defining himself. He was creating his own legend.
And this feeds directly into the rise of symbolism. We hear the terms decadence and symbolism used almost interchangeably when people talk about these guys. What's the real distinction there?
It's a bit of a blurry line, to be honest. In the fin de siècle, decadence was often a term used by critics to describe the lurid content, the moral decay, the focus on sickness, artificiality, sex, drugs, the darker side of urban life. Verlaine's life fit that perfectly. But symbolism, which got its official manifesto in 1886 from Jean Moreas, was really about the technique. It was about how you wrote.
Okay, so how did they write?
The Symbolists, with Verlaine as a key figure, completely rejected precise statement. They hated clear rhetoric. They didn't want to just describe a tree. They wanted to evoke the feeling that the tree gave you. They wanted to suggest, not to name, to use symbols to hint at a deeper reality.
Verlaine actually wrote a poem called Art Poétique, the Art of Poetry, where he basically lays this all out, right? It's like his mission statement.
It is, absolutely. If you want to understand modern poetry, you really have to look at this poem. It's an instruction manual for breaking the old rules. His first command is, music above everything else. De la musique avant toute chose.
He didn't want poetry to sound like prose or a lecture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He wanted it to be fluid, musical, closer to a song. He advocated for using the odd lampere. He preferred poetic meters with an odd number of syllables, 9 or 11, because they felt lighter, more unstable, less grounded than the rigid, even meters of the past, like the 12-syllable Alexandrine, which is the gold standard of French verse. He famously wrote that poets should keep away from the murderous sharp saying, cruel wit, and impure laugh.
That's so interesting, murderous sharp saying. He didn't want clever punchlines or witty observations.
No, he wanted veils. He wanted nuance. There's a great line in it where he says, nothing is more dear than the gray song where the indefinite joins the precise. He wanted to live in that twilight zone, that gray area where things aren't quite clear, where mood is everything.
Can we look at an example? Because there's that one line of his that I feel like everyone knows, or at least they've heard the sound of it, even if they don't know what it means.
You must be thinking of Il pleure dans mon cœur.
Yes, that's the one. Il pleure dans mon cœur comme il pleut sur la ville.
It is a masterpiece of untranslatable sound, just
Yeah.
pure atmosphere.
Why is it untranslatable? I mean, we can translate the words, right?
We can, but you lose the magic. So il pleut means it is raining. Il pleut means it is crying, or he is crying. But Verlaine creates this portmanteau, this sonic pun. He uses that shared vowel sound, the sound, to literally link the external weather with his internal emotional state.
So it cries in my heart as it rains on the town.
Roughly, yes. But in French, the words pleur and pleut almost melt into each other when you say them. He's not just making a comparison like, I am sad because it is raining. He's creating a single soundscape where the rain and the sadness are the same physical sensation. There's symbolism in a nutshell. It's the magic of words creating a mood rather than just describing a fact.
It's beautiful, and it's so deeply ironic because while he's crafting this delicate, nuanced gray poetry, his actual life is becoming less and less dignified. It's all harsh, black and white reality.
Tragically so. By the late 1880s and into the 90s, Verlaine is descending deep into addiction. He's drinking absinthe daily. He's living in slums and cheap hotels. He's spending huge chunks of time in public hospitals because his health is just failing completely. He had these terrible ulcers on his legs that wouldn't heal. He was a wreck.
He's the prince of poets, sleeping in a charity ward. It's a shocking image.
But here's the great paradox of his later years. As his body fell apart, his reputation skyrocketed. It's like the worse he got physically, the more famous he became.
Why do you think that was? Was it just the spectacle?
That was part of it, for sure. Crowds would actually gather to watch him in the cafes of the Latin Quarter. He was a kind of tourist attraction, the wild, debauched genius in the flesh. He would sit there, looking like a tramp, often drunk, mumbling his poetry. But it was also that his early work was being rediscovered. A whole new generation of young writers and artists realized that this man had broken the mold of French poetry.
And in 1894, he gets that title officially, doesn't he?
He does. A referendum was organized by the writer Maurice Barrès. They polled the writers and men of letters of France, who is our greatest living poet, and they elected Paul Verlaine the Prince of Poets.
That must have been such a strange moment for him, to be celebrated like that while living in utter poverty.
He was living in misery, yet he was literary royalty. And his influence was spreading beyond poetry, specifically into music.
Oh, right. You can't talk about Verlaine without talking about Debussy.
Absolutely. Verlaine's whole focus on musicality and suggestion made his work perfect for composers. Claude Debussy, Gabriel Fauré, Maurice Ravel, even Igor Stravinsky, they all set Verlaine's poems to music.
And the most famous one, of course, is Clair de Lune.
Exactly. Debussy's Clair de Lune, which is the third movement of his Suite Bergamasque, is directly inspired by Verlaine's poem of the same name. And Fauré's gorgeous song cycles, like La Bonne Chanson, are settings of those early love poems Verlaine wrote for his wife Mathilde.
Did Verlaine know that his work was being used like this? Was he aware of it?
He was. And unlike some poets who could be very protective of their words, Verlaine was apparently quite pleased. He understood that his words had a life beyond the page, that their music could be translated into actual music.
So his fame is growing, his influence is spreading, but his body is just giving out. He dies in 1896.
January 8th, 1896.
Mm-hmm.
He was only 51 years old. He died of acute pneumonia in Paris. It was a miserable, painful end, physically speaking.
And even his burial has a weird little footnote, an extra bit of chaos.
It does. It's so fitting, in a way. He was buried in the Batignolles Cemetery. But years later, in the 1960s, when they were building the Boulevard Périphérique, the big ring road that goes around Paris, his grave was in the way.
No way. They had to move him for a highway.
They did. They had to move his grave from the 20th Division of the cemetery to the 11th Division, which is actually a better, more prominent spot right on the roundabout. So even in death, the very modernization of the city he wrote about kept shifting him around.
You would think that's the end of the story. The poet dies, the legend is cemented, the students study the poems, the composers play the music. End of story. But there is one more chapter, and this is the one that it blew my mind when we were researching this.
It is the ultimate and most unbelievable vindication of the symbolist idea that a poem can mean more than it says.
Okay, so we're jumping forward in time, way forward. To 1944, World War II, France is occupied by the Nazis. The Allies are secretly planning the invasion of Normandy D-Day.
Operation Overlords. The BBC, broadcasting from London on a program called Radio Londres, needed a secure way to communicate with the French resistance on the ground, specifically to tell them the exact timing of the invasion.
They used these things called personal messages, right? These seemingly nonsense phrases that meant specific things to specific resistance groups.
Yes, hundreds of them. Things like the dice are on the table or the carrots are cooked. But for the general call to arms, the big one, the signal to the entire railway sabotage network that the invasion was finally imminent, they chose poetry. Specifically, they chose Paul Verlaine.
They used his poem, Chanson de Tom Autumn Song.
A poem from his very first collection, Poems Saturnion, the book he wrote when he was just a kid of 22.
So how did it work? How did this poem become a military code?
It was a brilliant two-part signal. The first part was broadcast on June 1st, 1944. The BBC announcer, in a deadpan voice, read the first three lines of the poem. Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne.
The long sobs of the violins of autumn.
When the resistance leaders across France heard that, they knew. Operation Overlord is starting within 2 weeks. Get ready. Clean your guns. Prepare the explosives. The clock is ticking.
And the Germans, did they know what was happening?
Their intelligence services actually picked it up. They knew this was a likely code. But the German command structure was so chaotic and they were so convinced the invasion would be at Calais, not Normandy, that they didn't fully mobilize their forces in the right place. They heard it, but they didn't act decisively.
Then came the second part, the final trigger.
June 5th, 1944. At 11:15 p.m. Paris time, the BBC broadcasts the next three lines of the poem. Blessant mon cœur d'une langueur monotone.
Wound my heart with a monotonous languor.
That was it. That was the trigger, the go-ahead. It meant the invasion would begin within 48 hours, and most likely within 24. It was the command to begin sabotage operations immediately, blowing up rail lines, cutting telephone wires, doing everything possible to cripple the German response when the troops hit the beaches.
That is just, it's chilling. You have to think about that. Verlaine wrote those lines in 1866. He was a young man, influenced by the Parnassians, writing about melancholy, about a vague sadness, about autumn leaves. He was just trying to capture a feeling, I feel sad and lethargic.
And 78 years later, those exact words became the command to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history and begin the liberation of France.
It's the ultimate irony for a man who wrote in his art of poetry that poets should avoid precise statements.
Exactly. He wanted nuance. He wanted veils. He wanted the indefinite. But history took his vaguest, most atmospheric, most melancholic poem and turned it into the most precise, tactical life or death instruction of the 20th century. Go. Explode the train now.
It really makes you wonder about the life of art, you know? Verlaine was a mess. He was the cursed poet. He destroyed his marriage. He shot his lover. He died drunk in a slum.
Okay.
But his work
survived him. It survived the scandal. It survived the prison sentence. It survived the changing literary fashions. And it became something larger, something more powerful than he could have ever possibly imagined.
So when we look back at Verlaine, what's the takeaway? Do you see the monster with the pistol or the genius with the pen? How do we reconcile the two?
I think we have to see both. You cannot separate the art from the life in Verlaine's case because the life was the raw material for the art. The tension between his desire for holiness, that Paul Murray identity his mother gave him, and his pull toward the gutter. That's the friction that makes the poetry vibrate. If he had stayed a happy, well-adjusted civil servant, we wouldn't be talking about him today.
And we certainly wouldn't be listening to Debussy's Clair de Lune.
No. And the French resistance would have had to find a different code.
It's a wild, wild journey. From the petit bourgeois boy to the gun-wielding lover, the convict convert, the prince of poets, and finally the unlikely voice of the resistance. Paul Verlaine lived about 10 lives in his 51 years.
And he left us with a challenge. In his Art Poétique, he said, a poem should be a happy occurrence. He wanted art to be a stroke of luck, a moment of unearned grace.
I think that's a great place to leave it. A happy occurrence in an otherwise tragic life.
Indeed. It sums it up perfectly.
So here's a final thought for you to chew on as we close out. Verlaine spent his whole life trying to blur the lines between right and wrong, between love and violence, between rain and tears. His whole artistic project was about resisting clear definition. Yet, history has a way of sharpening the focus, doesn't it? We remember the pistol shot. We remember the specific date and time of the D-Day broadcast. My question is this. Does art ultimately belong to the artist who creates it, or does history inevitably reshape it into whatever tool it needs at the time?
It is a fascinating question to consider.
Next time you hear Debussy's Clair de Lune or you just see the autumn leaves falling, take a second to think about the complicated, messy, brilliant man who gave us the words for that feeling. And maybe stay away from the absinthe.
Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.